44 times in history, soldiers looked their commanders dead in the eye and said, "No, we are not doing that." Stolen coconuts started a Pacific manhunt. Maggots in soup ended a Russian dynasty's career. A hat nearly lost India. From Roman emperors auctioned off like furniture to entire fleets going on strike, these are the wildest, dumbest, and most absurd mutinies the past ever recorded. Buckle up the time machine, because discipline is about to die 44 times in a row. 1. Stolen coconuts. That is the official, fully documented reason the most famous mutiny in naval history exploded near Tahiti in April 1789. Lieutenant William Bligh accused his own officers of raiding his personal fruit pile and shouted about it for days, until master's mate Fletcher Christian finally snapped. The crew, fresh off 6 months of Tahitian beach paradise, calmly bundled Bligh into a tiny launch with a sextant, 18 loyalists, and almost no supplies. Bligh, fueled by pure spite, sailed that bathtub 3,600 miles to safety. The mutineers vanished to remote Pitcairn, burned the bounty, and within 10 years, almost all of them were dead by their own quarrels. 2. Maggots in the borscht. That is genuinely how the most famous mutiny in Russian history kicked off aboard the battleship Potemkin in June 1905. The crew complained about meat that was, technically speaking, walking on its own. The ship's doctor inspected the soup, declared the maggots merely fly larvae and fully edible, which is a sentence that should have ended his medical career on the spot. The first officer threatened consequences for anyone refusing the meal. The sailors rose within the hour, raised the red flag, and steamed around the Black Sea, hunting for a friendlier port. 20 years later, Sergei Eisenstein turned the soup disaster into one of the most influential films ever made. 3. The Praetorian Guard auctioned the Roman Empire to the highest bidder in 193 AD. After turning on Emperor Pertinax over unpaid bonuses, the Guard climbed onto the palace walls and announced the empire was officially for sale to anyone with a fat enough wallet. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus showed up bidding, another man bid back from outside the gates, and the auction for the Roman world unfolded like the worst yard sale in human memory. Julianus won. He lasted 66 days before the frontier legions marched in and removed him. Rome, the Eternal City, briefly went on sale, and not one Praetorian saw a problem with that. 4. A hat. The Vellore Mutiny of 1806 might be history's silliest trigger for a real military rebellion, and it really did start over a hat. The British East India Company decided Indian sepoys needed a fashionable new uniform, complete with a stiff, round headpiece that looked, to Hindus and Muslims alike, suspiciously like Christian missionary headgear. The company also banned beards and forehead markings, because nothing builds soldier loyalty like aggressive grooming demands. The sepoys at Vellore Fort snapped, stormed the barracks at dawn, and briefly took the entire fortress. British cavalry galloped in within hours and ended it. The hat regulations were quietly repealed. 5. Roman Emperor Caligula managed to make even his own bodyguards turn on him in 41 AD. The Praetorian officer Cassius Chaerea was reportedly mocked daily by Caligula for having a high voice. Every day, Chaerea had to ask the emperor for the watchword pass to the guards, and Caligula would deliberately hand him embarrassing words like Venus or Priapus, then giggle while the manly soldier repeated them aloud. Chaerea had enough, gathered fellow officers, and ended Caligula's reign in a palace corridor that same week. Mocking your own armed bodyguard turned out to be, statistically speaking, a very poor long-term strategy. 6. Imagine pitching the around-the-world voyage to your bosses, getting funded, and then having 3 of your 5 captains turn on you in freezing Patagonia at Easter 1520. That was just Tuesday for Ferdinand Magellan. He held no meeting and sent no strongly worded scroll. Magellan had the patience of a brick and the management style of a thunderstorm. He quietly slipped loyal men onto the rebel flagship at night, retook it before breakfast, and marooned the plotting priest on a deserted beach with seagulls and regret as his only company. The remaining captains discovered a sudden, passionate love for Magellan's leadership style. 7. 50,000 Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Ottoman Sultan, turned mutiny into a national hobby for centuries. Their signature move? Whenever they were displeased, they would dramatically overturn their giant cauldrons of pilaf rice in the courtyard, a terrifying signal that meant trouble was coming for somebody important in the palace. They overthrew sultans, replaced grand viziers, and bullied emperors over salaries and rice quality with the same energy. Sultan Mahmud II ended their long career in 1826, locking them inside their barracks and disbanding the institution overnight. The most feared army in Europe finished forever, partly because they kept losing arguments about lunch. 8. Greased rifle cartridges nearly cost the British Empire all of India in 1857. The East India Company issued sepoys fancy new bullets that had to be bitten open. Then word spread that the grease was made from cow and pig fat, simultaneously offending Hindus and Muslims, a level of marketing genius that should be studied in business schools. At Meerut, sepoys refused to bite, were publicly humiliated, and the next morning their comrades rebelled across the entire north. The subcontinent burned for over a year. By the end, Parliament dissolved the East India Company and replaced it directly with the British Crown. An empire of trade gone, because no one read the label first. 9. 20,000 Roman gladiators and slaves under Spartacus pulled off the most famous mutiny against their owners in 73 BC, and they kicked it off by escaping a gladiator school using kitchen knives and cooking spits. From there, they raided a wagon of actual weapons, defeated multiple Roman legions, and roamed Italy for 2 full years, giving Rome an enormous headache. Spartacus reportedly turned down a chance to escape over the Alps because his men preferred to keep raiding Italy. That decision cost them everything, but for one brief moment, a man with a culinary fork humiliated the most powerful military on Earth, which is a flex worth retiring on. 10. Henry Hudson really did not understand the room. After surviving a winter so brutal in 1611 that his crew was eating moss and exchanging suspicious glances over the dinner pot, Hudson cheerfully announced his next plan, more exploring. His men, who had developed a strong personal preference for going home alive, expressed disagreement by tying him up. They placed Hudson, his teenage son, and a few sick crewmen into a small open boat, cut the rope, and waved goodbye. Hudson was never seen again. The mutineers sailed home expecting nooses, but the Crown took one look at their incredible new maps and decided that good geography forgives most sins. 11. A Russian noblewoman accidentally invented the politest coup d'etat in 1762. Catherine the Great, then merely Catherine, decided her husband Tsar Peter III was simply too embarrassing to keep around. What with him idolizing Prussia, insulting the Russian Orthodox Church, and reportedly playing with toy soldiers as a grown adult emperor. She convinced the Imperial Guard to turn on her behalf. The soldiers happily agreed, set Peter aside without much fuss, and crowned Catherine ruler of Russia practically over breakfast. Peter signed his abdication, complaining mostly about being separated from his pet dog and his violin. Catherine then ruled for 34 years. 12. One word. That is all Julius Caesar needed to defeat his own mutinying army outside Rome in 47 BC. His veterans had marched in demanding discharges, bonuses, and respect. Caesar walked out, looked them dead in the eye, and addressed them as citizens instead of fellow soldiers. The crowd gasped. Battle-hardened veterans started weeping and begging to be allowed back into the army. Years earlier, in 49 BC, when his 9th Legion mutinied, Caesar simply threatened decimation, and the legion remembered they were no longer thirsty. The man's deadliest weapon was, in the end, vocabulary. 13. Alexander the Great, conqueror of half the known world, was finally stopped in 326 BC, not by an army, not by giant war elephants, but by a group of grumbling veterans saying no. At the Hyphasis River in India, his Macedonian troops stared at the monsoon rain, the rumored mega-elephants on the far bank, and 8 years of non-stop marching, and quietly sat down on their shields. Alexander, stunned that his men had developed opinions, locked himself in his tent and sulked for 3 full days like a teenager whose parents had grounded him. They did not budge. The empire-shattering god-king of antiquity, defeated by tired feet and bad weather. 14. The politest mutiny in human history broke out at Spithead Anchorage in April 1797. The entire British Channel Fleet, the floating wall protecting England from Napoleon, simply refused to move. 16 ships of the line raised the red flag in perfect synchronization. Their demands? Pay that had not increased since 1658, edible food instead of biscuits crawling with extra protein, and shore leave to actually see their wives. They kept saluting officers and maintained perfect discipline throughout. The Admiralty, sweating bullets about a French invasion, caved on every demand within weeks. The king signed a pardon. Mutiny by manners, undefeated. 15. Picture being a bankrupt apothecary, plotting to seize a Dutch East India Company flagship and turn pirate, only to have the ship rudely interrupt your evil plan by smashing into a reef off Australia in 1629. That was Jeronimus Cornelis, history's unluckiest villain. Stranded on a tiny sandbar with no kingdom worth ruling, Cornelis simply crowned himself king of 3 rocks. He designed a fancy red cloak from looted curtains, gave himself royal titles, and started issuing important orders nobody asked for. When rescuers finally arrived months later, they were thoroughly confused. The fanciest monarch on earth, ruling 2 seagulls and 1 very tired crab. 16. Pugachev's rebellion of 1773 was less a mutiny and more an extended cosplay event with serious consequences. A Cossack soldier named Yemelyan Pugachev declared he was actually the long-dead Tsar Peter III, miraculously returned, and somehow tens of thousands of soldiers, peasants, and Cossacks across the Volga region believed him. Whole Russian garrisons mutinied and joined his cause. He took cities, crowned himself emperor, and even held a fake royal court complete with fake nobles. Catherine the Great eventually crushed him, and he was paraded back to Moscow in an iron cage for trial. The man fooled an empire with confidence and a beard. 17. Fighting a revolution without pay turned out to be a deeply unpopular business model. On New Year's Day, 1781 at Morristown, 1,500 freezing Continental soldiers of the Pennsylvania line packed up their cannons and marched toward Philadelphia for a very firm chat with Congress. British spies arrived grinning, offering bags of gold to switch sides. The mutineers, offended at the suggestion they were traitors, immediately handed the spies straight over to the authorities, who were not amused. Picture the British agent who showed up with a wallet and left in chains. Congress, panicking, paid up. The fastest way to find missing payroll, apparently, is to let it march toward you. 18. Spain in January 1820, and Colonel Rafael del Riego is in the southern port of Cadiz, ordered to ship out with 20,000 soldiers to crush rebellions in South America. The men hated everything about it: the months of terrible food, the ships full of disease, the war they did not want, and Riego sided with them. He led the entire expedition in mutiny, marched north, and demanded King Ferdinand VII restore the liberal constitution. The king, completely cornered, agreed. Spain entered 3 years of constitutional rule, known as the Trienio Liberal. One colonel, refusing to board the boats, reshaped Spanish politics for a generation and inspired liberal revolts across all of Europe. 19. A captain so universally despised his crew shared his orders like cursed bedtime stories. That was Captain Hugh Pigot of HMS Hermione, sailing the Caribbean in 1797. Pigot was the kind of officer who would order an extra punishment because a sailor sneezed at the wrong angle, and his philosophy could be summed up as more discipline, always more. After months of unhinged treatment, the crew finally took the ship by force and sailed it straight into an enemy Spanish port. The Spanish were thrilled to receive a free British frigate. The Royal Navy spent the next decade quietly hunting every mutineer across the planet. They got most of them. 20. The year is 14 AD. The great Augustus has just died, and the Roman legions on the Danube look at their nervous new emperor Tiberius and decide it is officially renegotiation season. Their list of demands? Shorter service, actual pay, and please stop sending centurions whose real nickname was "Give Me Another," because they kept snapping wooden vine staves over soldiers' backs like angry teachers with rulers. Up on the Rhine, troops tried crowning the popular General Germanicus emperor against his will. Germanicus dramatically threatened to stab himself with a sword. A bored soldier in the front row mockingly handed him a sharper one and said, "Here, sir, try this." 21. Spring 1917, and General Robert Nivelle confidently promised that one glorious offensive would smash Germany in 48 hours flat. It did not. After 187,000 French casualties, soldiers in 49 divisions, roughly half the entire French army, looked at their officers and politely said, "We are done charging machine guns, thank you." They did not desert. They still defended the trenches, they simply refused to attack again. Some baaed like sheep when ordered forward, which is a legendary level of frontline sass. General Pétain took over, gave them leave, hot food, and stopped the suicidal charges. The Germans never figured any of it out. France was saved by a very firm no. 22. Mamluk soldiers in Egypt, originally slave soldiers from the Caucasus, invented the concept of mutinying their way to becoming an entire ruling class. In 1250, the elite Bahri Mamluks, fed up with their Ayyubid sultan, simply removed him and put their own commander on the throne. Then they did it again and again. For 2.5 centuries, Egypt was ruled by mutinous slave soldiers who kept replacing each other in increasingly creative ways. The kicker, they were brilliant rulers who stopped the Mongols cold at Ain Jalut in 1260. The only example in history of mutiny becoming a working government model. 23. Sailors at the Nore anchorage in May 1797 watched Spithead's polite victory and thought, "Let us try the exact same trick, but with extra attitude." Catastrophic mistake. Their leader, Richard Parker, began blockading the Thames, halting merchant ships from reaching London, and shouting at newspapers daily. Public sympathy flipped from AW, the brave sailors, to lock them up immediately in roughly 4 days flat. The Royal Navy starved them out by quietly removing the harbor boys so the ships could not even sneak out at night. The whole rebellion collapsed in confusion. Parker was hanged from the yardarm of his own flagship. The Navy never forgot the lesson. 24. Russian Imperial Guards officers, in December 1825, staged possibly the most awkward mutiny in history when they marched their troops into Senate Square in St. Petersburg and forgot to plan what came next. They wanted constitutional monarchy. They wanted reform. They wanted Constantine instead of Nicholas I as Tsar. What they did not have was an actual plan. Their men, many of whom did not understand the politics, reportedly chanted for Constantine and his wife Constitutia, thinking the word constitution was the name of his wife. Tsar Nicholas crushed it within hours with cannon fire. The Decembrists became eternal Russian heroes anyway, mostly through tragic poetry. 25. Castilian soldiers under King Charles V had no patience for being unpaid, so in 1576 they mutinied in spectacularly bad style and sacked the city of Antwerp, an event known forever after as the Spanish Fury. They were technically supposed to be guarding it. Picture being the city accountant and watching your own protection detail loot the building over a missed paycheck. The damage permanently dented Spanish prestige across Europe. Spanish soldiers in the Low Countries mutinied so often that historians counted 45 separate mutinies between 1572 and 1607, roughly one organized strike every 9 months. The most feared army in Europe, undone by accounting errors. 26. The Bull Ring. That was the cheerful nickname British soldiers gave to the training camp at Etaples in France, a place they passionately hated with every fiber of their being. In September 1917, after a military policeman accidentally shot a New Zealand soldier during an arrest gone sideways, thousands of British and Commonwealth troops lost it. They rioted for nearly a week, chased officers around the streets, freed prisoners, and held a massive, unauthorized vacation in town. The British government was so embarrassed, they hid the records for decades. The official report called the affair a minor disturbance, which is a creative way to describe an army temporarily forgetting it was an army. 27. A Byzantine general named Bardas Phocas led one of history's longest mutinies in 987 AD, which became a polite 3-year argument about who deserved to be emperor. Phocas declared himself emperor, marched on Constantinople, and besieged the city for ages. Emperor Basil II responded by hiring 6,000 massive Viking warriors from Kievan Rus, the legendary Varangian Guard, an imported tactical squad swinging axes the size of small trees. Phocas reportedly collapsed mid-battle from a stroke simply by getting too excited charging forward. He fell off his horse and never got back up. Mutinies are usually defeated by armies. This one was defeated by basic cardiovascular health. 28. A few elderly German admirals, in October 1918, decided the entire high seas fleet should sail out and fight the Royal Navy in one final, beautiful, glorious goodbye cruise, even though Berlin was already negotiating peace at the same time. The sailors, who could in fact read calendars, looked at this plan and said, "No thank you, sir." They put out the boilers, raised red flags, and within days, the mutiny spread to Kiel, where 40,000 sailors took over the entire city. The Kaiser abdicated. The empire ended. The war stopped. All because a few retired aged gentlemen wanted a heroic photo opportunity, and the men below decks correctly identified it as the worst pitch ever. 29. The Curragh incident of March 1914 was the rare case where British Army officers mutinied not over bad pay or rotten food, but over a government policy they personally disliked. Stationed at the Curragh camp in Ireland, 57 officers under Brigadier Hubert Gough informed London they would resign rather than enforce Home Rule against Ulster Protestants. The British government panicked and backed down. Officers refusing duty because they disagreed with Parliament's politics, and getting away with it set a wonderfully awkward precedent. The whole affair is widely considered a major reason World War I found Britain dangerously distracted by its own Irish question. 30. The Fez Mutiny of April 1912 saw Moroccan soldiers in the new French-trained Sultan's army turn on their European officers in the streets of the imperial capital. Pay had not arrived for months. Rumors swirled that French missionaries were converting their families. When officers ordered another drill in the heat, the Askari soldiers refused, then opened fire on the French instructors directly. Dozens of European officers and civilians fell within hours. French reinforcements stormed Fez, retook the city, and the French protectorate over Morocco was signed weeks later. A mutiny meant to push France out of Morocco accidentally handed France the entire country. History's worst negotiating tactic. 31. The biggest plot twist in Russian history. The sailors of Kronstadt, once the proudest revolutionaries in all of Russia, the men Trotsky himself had personally called the pride and glory of the revolution, turned on the Bolsheviks in March 1921. Their crime? They wanted free elections, a free press, and an end to grain seizures starving their families. Trotsky's response was to send Red Army troops marching across the frozen Gulf of Finland in white camouflage. 4 years after being called heroes of the revolution, they were branded enemies of it. Most survivors never came home. The revolution ate its own first. 32. A massive group of Spanish conquistador soldiers in Peru mutinied against the crown in 1544, led by the gloriously named Gonzalo Pizarro. They were furious because Spain banned them from forcing Native Americans into labor, which was, conveniently, the only business model they understood. Gonzalo Pizarro defeated the royal viceroy in open battle, then declared himself ruler of Peru, which is a bold career move from a man who used to be middle management. Spain eventually sent a soft-spoken priest, Pedro de la Gasca, who arrived with no army at all, just letters of pardon, and quietly convinced everyone to switch sides. Gonzalo lost everything, defeated by paperwork. 33. Picture waking up to discover your government has slashed your pay by 25%, while the admirals barely felt it. That was the morning of September 1931 for the British Atlantic Fleet anchored at Invergordon in Scotland. 15 warships immediately went on strike, refused to leave harbor, and the sailors started singing protest songs in the messes. Nobody got hurt. Nobody even raised their voice. The men simply stayed put. The London financial markets, however, lost their minds. The pound sterling collapsed within a week, Britain abandoned the gold standard, and the pay cuts were hastily reversed. A polite Scottish sit-down rewrote the global economy. 34. The Revolt of the Lash in November 1910 saw Brazilian sailors seize the country's two newest battleships, the Minas Gerais and the São Paulo, the most modern warships in the entire Western Hemisphere at the time. The trigger? Officers were still flogging black sailors with cat-o'-nine-tails whips, decades after slavery had ended in Brazil. Led by sailor João Candido, the mutineers turned the guns on Rio de Janeiro itself and demanded flogging be abolished. The government caved within 4 days, signed the law, and then quietly arrested most of the leaders anyway. Candido survived to die forgotten in poverty. Brazil eventually named him a national hero. 80 years too late. 35. A wild rumor and some very bored German prisoners of war managed to set Singapore on fire in February 1915. The 5th Light Infantry, an Indian Muslim regiment serving the British, heard whispers they were about to be shipped off to fight fellow Muslims for the Ottoman Empire's enemies. German prisoners helpfully fanned the rumor for sheer entertainment, like history's worst next-door neighbors. On Chinese New Year, half the regiment mutinied and ran wild through the city. The British scrambled together possibly the strangest rescue squad ever assembled: Japanese Marines, French sailors, Russian crews, and local volunteers. The British then quietly censored the entire incident from history for decades. 36. 30,000 soldiers in the army of Sui dynasty Emperor Yang of China mutinied in 618 AD because the emperor had truly perfected the art of being awful at his job. He had bankrupted the empire building a massive canal, tried to invade Korea 3 times unsuccessfully, and reportedly demanded fresh fruit be delivered to his palace from across the country, regardless of cost. His own elite guards finally removed him in his bathhouse, and the dynasty collapsed within months. The replacement Tang dynasty took over and ruled brilliantly for nearly 3 centuries. Sometimes the best thing for an empire is to fire the man demanding artisanal lychees during a famine. 37. Irish soldiers fighting for an empire currently burning down their own homeland. That was the situation facing the Connaught Rangers, stationed in faraway Jalandhar in India in June 1920, when news of British abuses back in Ireland reached the barracks. They grounded their rifles, hoisted the Irish tricolour over the parade ground, and announced they were not doing any more imperial paperwork until British forces left Ireland alone. The mutiny spread quickly to Solon Barracks. 88 men faced court-martial. Private James Daly, just 21 years old, was the last British soldier ever executed for mutiny. 2 years later, Ireland got its independence anyway. 38. A magnificent mutiny erupted in 1647 when new model army soldiers, the disciplined Puritan force that had just won the English Civil War for Parliament, decided Parliament was being deeply stingy about back wages and started electing their own representatives called agitators. Yes, that was their actual job title. They held the Putney debates, where ordinary soldiers casually argued political philosophy with their generals about voting rights, equality, and government, 3 centuries ahead of schedule. Oliver Cromwell eventually crushed the radicals, but the soldiers had basically invented the idea of democracy with extra steps. Imagine winning a war, and your bosses immediately ghost you on payroll. 39. Bombay, February, 1946. Indian sailors of the Royal Indian Navy decided that rotten food, racist British officers, and broken post-war independence promises were not, in fact, the deal they signed up for. The mutiny started on HMIS Talwar and exploded within 48 hours to 78 ships and 20,000 sailors. Union Jacks came down. Congress flags, Muslim League flags, and communist flags all went up side by side, a combination historians still squint at in pure disbelief. Bombay civilians rallied in support. Britain, exhausted and broke, suddenly realized ruling India had become militarily impossible. Within 18 months, the British were packing the suitcases. 40. The Chilean naval mutiny of September 1931 was the Great Depression coming home to roost on the Pacific coast. Sailors aboard the battleship Almirante La Torre, anchored at Coquimbo Bay, refused to accept government pay cuts of up to 30% during the worst economic collapse Chile had ever seen. The mutiny spread fast. 11 ships joined within hours, and the rebels demanded the cuts be reversed and the cabinet resign. The Chilean Air Force was sent in to bomb the rebel fleet from above. The mutiny collapsed in days, but the political shockwave helped topple the entire government within weeks. Sailors with empty pockets ending presidencies, twice in the same year on opposite sides of the planet. 41. The USS Somers in 1842 had the dramatic distinction of hosting the only formal mutiny case in United States Navy history that ended in officers ordering executions right there at sea. The wild part? Historians still argue about whether there was even a mutiny at all. Captain Alexander Slidell Mackenzie believed Midshipman Philip Spencer was plotting to seize the ship and turn pirate, partly based on a suspicious list of names written in Greek letters found in his locker. Without a proper trial, Spencer and 2 crewmen were swiftly dealt with. The scandal back home was enormous. The case directly inspired Herman Melville's novella Billy Budd, an entire literary classic born from a captain who possibly invented his own mutiny. 42. A textbook example of mutiny by misunderstanding broke out in 1804 when Irish convicts and rebel soldiers transported to Australia rose up at Castle Hill near Sydney. Their plan: march to Parramatta, seize ships, and sail home to Ireland from the literal opposite side of the planet. Geography was, shall we say, not their strong suit. Around 250 rebels armed with farming tools and a few stolen muskets faced trained redcoats outside the colony. The fight ended quickly. Their leader, Philip Cunningham, was hanged the same day. The whole episode became known as the Battle of Vinegar Hill, named after a famous Irish battle, which gives you a sense of how attached they were to home. 43. A chaotic mutiny erupted in the Austrian Imperial Army in February 1918 when sailors at the Bay of Kotor, fed up with the war, raised red flags on 40 warships and demanded peace. Austrian admirals, deeply confused, sent in artillery from the shore. The mutiny collapsed within 3 days, and 4 ringleaders faced firing squads. But here is the wild part. The mutiny inspired similar uprisings across the entire crumbling empire, lighting the fuse that ended Austria-Hungary forever. Within months, the empire that had ruled Central Europe for centuries simply ceased to exist. 40 restless ships and a few red flags ended a 600-year-old monarchy. 44. The 10,000 Greek mercenaries in 401 BC pulled off probably the most legendary mutiny by survival in ancient history. Hired by the Persian prince Cyrus the Younger for what they thought was a routine little campaign, they marched deep into the Persian Empire only to discover Cyrus had actually planned to overthrow his own brother the king. Cyrus died at the Battle of Cunaxa. Their generals were promptly invited to a peace dinner that ended very badly for them. Stranded 1,000 miles from home, the soldiers held a dramatic open-air vote, elected new commanders, including a young Athenian writer named Xenophon, and marched all the way back to Greece fighting through everything. Then Xenophon literally wrote the best-selling book about it. 44 mutinies, 44 reminders that empires fall when the men with the sword stop listening. Now the real fight begins, in the comments. Out of every commander on this list, name the one who actually deserved it and the one whose crew were just whiny cowards looking for excuses. Pick a side, name names, and defend it. We will be reading the most savage takes out loud in the next video. Smash that like button, subscribe before history catches up to us, and try not to start a riot down there.